Right, Angus, do you want to do your impression of Chris Whitty, and I'll hit the button?
So we've in our division of labour, I've decided that today Ollie will drive the slides and I will be Chris Whitty, and I will keep an eye on the chat and tell him to move the slides on because I no longer have control. So we're gonna. This is something that we've been playing around with for a little while now. There's 3 different people in Lancaster who do stuff in sort of game space. You've already seen Raf talk about his Minecraft stuff in a previous session. So this is the other bit of what we do. So it's really just to set through 2 different experiences that Ollie and I have doing rather different things, but both in the same broad space. So if you want to move on, Ollie. So we're going to try and do 3 very brief things. Just first of all, a bit of terminology clarification about what we mean when we say game-based learning and gamification, and for disambiguation. This is an audience where we probably don't have to explain those terms, but we at least have to disambiguate what we mean when we say them. Then we'll showcase our practice, and then we'll outline some of the things that we found challenging. And I think the questions that how much further we can go with this new experience, the hurdles that we think are present. So we'll look at those 3 things in turn. So first, to the disambiguation. So gamification, I think we all it's used quite a lot. We're not really talking about it too much today, and that's using sort of game-based mechanics to encourage engagement. And sort of Kahoot obviously is one that's probably used in higher education most. I think Duolingo is the prime exponent of gamification as driving everything forward. If anyone's ever used Duolingo, it is every possible gamification tool at 100 miles an hour every second you interact with the platform. It is gamification on steroids. And it's very effective at getting you to keep doing it, but does it actually improve learning? Or is it just a way to sort of keep you clicking and engaging with the platform? So I think what we're talking about is hopefully game-based learning on the other hand. Well done, Ollie. Which is, I forgot we had those animations in there. Is using mechanics, game mechanics themselves as part of the learning process rather than as just an engagement encouragement. So we're looking at how the mechanics of a game or the game itself can facilitate and encourage learning activity rather than just engagement. So serious games, and that's all these probably more on the serious games end. I'm using game mechanics that found in games where I can see crossover into what I'm trying to students engage with the learning itself. I'm trying to teach them game theory by using games, which seems like an obvious thing, but you can see how the actual content is the game itself. So that's just to sort of try and disambiguate 2 of those phrases. So I think we now move over to Ollie, who's going to talk about what he does in this space and his experience.
Thanks, Angus. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you today about a game-based learning intervention, I think, game-based learning, that I use in my 2nd year cybercrime and cybercriminology case. So course, should I say. So the video that you're seeing here, I hope nobody gets motion sick because you might feel it a little bit whilst you're staring at the screen, I've just realised. But this is a virtual crime scene that I've created using a program called Zoe Immersive, using the Meta Quest 2 virtual reality headset. And this is used for me as a focal point within a workshop as part of this module. And with it, we explore concepts around policing, and specifically the policing of cybercrime using digital evidence, which I'll talk about in a moment. I think it's a game-based learning tool. It may be, Angus has suggested serious games. I'm not sure if I like the term particularly. I think it's all play, but certainly it's a simulation. I think we could talk about it in terms of simulation. I don't know whether you're interested in those kind of disambiguations. So I kind of want to first of all start off by saying what I'm not saying in kind of this little spiel is the virtual reality is a kind of silver bullet, end all be all. This is where teaching's going. I think I've been accused of kind of talking like that a few times, and that's not at all what I'm trying to do. What I am saying is though that I identified a need, and VR helped me to fulfill that need within my course. And there may be other opportunities to do that kind of thing. It does not apply in the vast majority of even my cybercrime course, but it certainly applied here. So I inherited the cybercrime and cybercriminality course this year. And one of the specific topics that we were looking at was policing and preventing cybercrime. And within that topic, I needed to fulfill some specific learning objectives, including looking at the kind of plethora of data that was available from all of these new technologies that were being kind of spread, and this ever increasing amount of data that's potentially available that might get sucked up in criminal investigations. And then also think about some of the criminological and criminal justice problems that are associated with that. So things like the strip search, the digital strip search as it's been called, and how police are kind of treating that data and what it might be used for further down the line. So that's what the kind of learning objectives of the session, I suppose, were. And policing is something that is quite kind of close to my heart because I was a police officer previously. So this is something that I have experienced training of within the police. And so I was kind of inspired to create the session as a result of this police training. So police training usually comes in kind of three main systems, I suppose. The first is learning by rote. So what is the legislation? Kind of need to know it to be able to enforce it. So lots of kind of sitting and memorizing verbatim stuff. And then there's the slightly more painful learning on the job stuff. This is a picture of me having been sprayed with CS gas. I've not yet found a learning objective that will allow me to bring CS gas into the classroom, but if anybody has any ideas, please do let me know. So those kind of things didn't really apply, but one thing that did apply from the police training that I had was simulation work. So I've done quite a lot of work in that training around, in particular, Hydra simulations. So a simulation where you're given a scenario, you're working as a team, you're fed information, you're watched by kind of externals, and then you develop what you're going to do based on that. I also experienced a little bit of the emergence of virtual reality training within the police. So I haven't used this particular bit of software and hardware combination, the Axon taser training stuff that they're doing. They're doing quite a lot of work around firearms training in the US using virtual reality, when to pull the trigger, when not to pull the trigger, and we're getting a bit of that over here in the UK. But what I have experienced is a virtual reality crime scene. Not specifically the one that you can see on the screen there, Scan Labs. That's quite a new, really high resolution one, actually. It looks really great. Mine didn't look that good, the one that I saw. But, you know, these are some of the interventions that are being built up to assist police officers in their training. I specifically went through a version of the Scan Lab stuff, I guess, a crime scene that was dedicated to the training of searching for digital evidence. And that was based on actually a bricks and mortar house that was at my old police headquarters that was set up specifically so that police officers would go through, find digital evidence and decide based on a scenario they were fed what they wanted to seize. And obviously there are lots of problems with that. Number one, it's just a house full of kit that isn't used most of the time unless there's a class going through it. And number two, you needed to buy more kit to keep it up to date. So it became very expensive very quickly. So as soon as VR training emerged, that was one of the first things that the constabulary looked at and said, can we reproduce this in virtual reality? So at that point, you should be asking yourself, but Ollie, why did you make your own rather than just get the one that you'd played with or the Scan Labs one? And the reason for that is because I tried to, and they were going to charge me £60,000 for their bit of software. So I decided that probably wouldn't be something that I'd get funding for. So I looked to build my own. So I did get a little bit of money from the law school here at Lancaster. They gave me about £400 to buy a Quest 2 headset, not too dissimilar to that one. I then went out and found a bit of free software that you can get off the Meta store. If you want, well, I say free, give you credentials to Facebook, but Zoe Immersive is the piece of software that I used, which allows you to create scenes in virtual reality that are interactive, so you can do things with the objects within those scenes. And I kind of built my own scene using Zoe Immersive. The important thing with Zoe is that there's no coding required, so you don't need to be a games developer to use it. It's all done within VR, so you are actually moving walls around using the headset, moving objects around and that kind of thing. So that's what I did to create this scene. So this is what we came up with in the end, really. So it's a workshop for around 15 students, part two, which is our second and third years that take it. This video, again, is the walkthrough that you saw earlier on, but I thought it was useful for you to have it as context there. So it's a role-playing scenario, first and foremost. So I give them their role. They are digital media investigators. They're going through this house. It's the house of a drug dealer. He's run off somewhere, and we're trying to find evidence in order to support this investigation. They're given tasks. So first of all, they need to search. They need to search the environment. They need to interact with the objects that are in there. So you can see that there was a mobile phone on the counter. There's a CCTV camera up there. There's a drone on the top of that cupboard. And they have to interact with those things and then discuss as a class Is this useful to us? What data might we get out of it? And then if they decide as a class that they want to seize that item, then they have to go and put it on the rug at the front door. It's just an easy way of getting them to tell me exactly what they were going to do. Then I'll introduce them to the technology. So I'll explain the headset and the controllers and all of that kind of stuff. And then safety is one of the big issues as well, because you're really blindfolding a student when they go into this system. There are lots of kind of health kind of warnings that go with it as well. So if you're pregnant, if you're epileptic, that kind of thing, we need to make sure that that's all covered. So I deal with that stuff at the start as well. Then we do drawing of lots. So this is a 50-minute workshop. So if everybody wanted to get involved in it, 15 people, we were never going to get 3 people. So I basically landed on 3 people per session could use the actual headset itself. So anybody that wanted to would put their kind of name in a hat, and then I would draw the first 3 names out and they would go into it. And that also meant that if they didn't want to, or they couldn't for any of the reasons listed in the safety briefing, then they didn't have to put their name in, and they didn't have to kind of mention that to the people in the seminar room. They just didn't have to put their name in. Then we run through the seminar. So it ended up being an asymmetric learning experience. So this is a photograph of Angus, myself, and one of our colleagues, Tom. We're not using my specific experience. We're playing Beat Saber, but the same thing applies. So we have one person in VR. Everybody else is watching on the screen and they can communicate verbally with the person in VR. Go and look at that thing up there, or pick that up, or yes, we are going to seize that. No, we're not going to seize that. Then we debrief. So I'm kind of guiding the conversations, but at the end, I kind of bring everybody back into the room and kind of say, right, you know, how does this apply to what it is that we want to kind of talk about from a learner objective point of view? I did some exit feedback stuff using an online questionnaire. And they got some really good feedback, which we'll talk about in pros. So first of all, it met all those learner objectives. We got to explore, from a practitioner point of view, the digital evidence stuff. And we also got to think about it in critical terms that maybe we wouldn't have been able to if we hadn't have had that experience. It was by far the most engagement on the course. People who had never spoken, this was in week 6 of the course, were suddenly verbose in at least 2 out of these 3 seminars, but in all of them, there were much more engagement. Really good positive feedback. Everybody that replied to that questionnaire said that it was fantastic. They gave me an A grade. I was very scared of asking my students to grade me, but they were very kind, which is nice. And I even got an actual email from a student, not asking for anything, just telling me that they enjoyed the seminar. Never happened before, never happened since, but that is in a folder somewhere for promotion stuff. And then cheaper than professional solution. So it took me 3 hours to build the solution in VR. I felt quite sick afterwards because of the motion sickness stuff, but ultimately I didn't have to spend £60,000 to do it, which was a real bonus. And hopefully now we've got a platform in the law school at Lancaster that we can build on, and if other people have applications, then we can use the same technology to do the same thing. Angus, over to you.
Thank you, Ollie. That was all very high-tech and impressive. Now for something much more low-tech and arguably less impressive, and involving turnips. I teach competition law. I've been teaching law students game theory for years, which is not always easy. So therefore, I've turned to different means of trying to teach game theory to turnips. Students through turnips, and it works, I think, quite successfully. Can you move it on, Ollie? So the classic way we teach it is by using sort of prisoner's dilemma. So we talk about the classic, 2 prisoners in a cell, there's evidence against them, but the only way they're going to get a major conviction is by someone confessing, and you do the defect or confess, confess or not confess, and you treat prisoner's dilemma that way. Do you cooperate or do you defect? And what drives those decisions? So that's classic game theory, but it's sometimes very abstract for students. They don't necessarily, because essentially it's maths. So you're trying to teach lawyers maths, and that's challenging because they don't think that way, a lot of them. That's not their natural ways of doing it. So I thought, how can I get these mathsy ideas about prisoner's dilemma across? And I thought, use games, because a lot of commercial board games use that mechanic of game theory style mechanics, strategic thinking mechanics as part of the game. So I decided to give that a shot. So we invented competition law games nights. Ollie, next slide. So the students are invited to competition law games night. It's an extracurricular evening session, so it's not part of timetable sessions. And again, that's that. I'm inviting you to do something. I'm not requiring you to do it. It's a bit out of the ordinary. Initially, I didn't know if it would work or not. I didn't know if anyone would come or not, and it would be better to do it that way. But And we play a number of games. The class favourite they've voted for every year after the games night is Village Pillage, which is, where the turnips come in. You've got to try and win enough turnips by either farming turnips in your village or raiding other villages. And essentially, it's a card-based game where you play rock, paper, scissors style game against two people simultaneously, one person to your left and one person to your right, and to try and build up your turnip stash or raid other people's turnip stashes. But essentially, you're thinking strategically, if I need to do this, what will they do? So you've got to try and predict your opponent's move and then counter your opponent's move and do you sort of double bluff. And so the game is built around the idea of strategic thinking and planning about what someone else might do and how you change your behavior and what they might do in the future. So you can see how that relates to the prisoner's dilemma. Next slide, Olly, please. And then we play another game we play is Saboteur, where students are dwarves mining for gold, or are they saboteurs? One person in the group is possibly a saboteur, one or more people might be a saboteur, but the rest of you are gold miners, and you're trying to get towards the gold, or are they saboteurs? And again, it's another game where you don't know who's who, and you're trying to determine who's who from what cards they play and what their actions are, and the other players are trying to disguise who they are. If you're the saboteur, you don't want to be caught as a saboteur because then you'll easily get knocked out of the game by the miners. So again, it's a game of sort of bluff and strategic thinking about how will my actions be perceived by the other players and how we're working. But what we're trying to do as tutors during this session is not just teach the students how to play the games, because that's a big part of it, but also trying to introduce language and ways of thinking which go back to the prisoner's dilemma. So that when we're playing the games, we're trying to introduce that language and talk about the decisions they're making in the same sort of way we talk about decision making in game theory, so that they're learning the language as they play the games, because the game mechanics help them understand and practice how that language works against their own actions in a real situation, even though that situation is that you're pretending to be a dwarf mining for gold or a saboteur. All right, so we move on then. After games night, when they've had the fun of playing the games, we bring that back into the classroom, and the workshop that follows up that session, we play a much more technical economic game, which is a multi-shot pricing game where this time they're a business and the groups decide on how they price a product. And then the amount of profit they make is determined by what their price is and the other team's price is, and they're trying to sort of maximize their income by making pricing decisions. And that graph you see is the outcome from one of those sessions whereby the students pick their prices and you see what their profitabilities are, and then they try and maximize their outcomes through that. And in that, we again try and use the same language as tutors as we did in the game session to get them to think about how they're making these decisions in the same way in a much more economic context, and whether the outcomes are what they expect or different. So you're trying to bring that language back together again and teach them that theory, that principle about how they're making decisions and how that impacts on what decisions they make in the same way as it was during games night. Olly, next slide, please. So what do we learn from that process? Well, the things are the students actually, they want to engage with us. People like playing games. So therefore, I've had quite good take-up on games night. We generally get about half of the course there. So not too bad, because they've got busy time commitments. It's an evening. We do it from sort of 6 to 8 o'clock to try and catch as many people as possible. So you really need 2 hours to do it in. It's easy to get them engaged. The difficult part is actually getting to sneak the content, the actual learning, into the games, because they're happy to play the games, but our difficult thing is to sneak that game. It's also quite useful just actually to do it in a social setting. The first time we did it, we were very lucky. One of our students happened to run a pizza place in town and saw it as an opportunity to get some free publicity and said, will it be okay if we bring pizza along to share for everyone at games night? So it became a pizza and board games night, which was very popular for the students. Free pizza is always a good way in. But then when you try and take it back into class, so the games night went very well, everyone enjoys it, but then it's difficult because when you go back into the class, they quickly change back into classroom mode, and they become much more serious, much more formal. Not everyone has been at games night, and the interactions change, and the social nature of the interactions change, and it gets much more formal, and they get much more instrumental. And one thing I'll come back to later, it's sometimes very difficult to see get the more instrumental students to connect the play with the learning, because they see them as very different things and they don't make the connections very easily. And it's how do we encourage them to make those? The other things we learn is that law students are stupidly competitive, and they break economics. The economic theory says the result should be this, because that's the sensible, rational economic result. Law students don't do the sensible, economic, rational result. They are so competitive, they will kill themselves to win, and therefore they break economic theory. But at least we understand how they break economic theory and why. All right, next slide, please, Ollie. Okay, so this is where the forward learning bit, and we've embraced that, embracing the chaos and learning to love the uncertain, because gameplay is about the uncertain. So I think it's how do we bring that, engage with that uncertainty into the learning process. And back over to you, Ollie.
I'm muted. Right. Yeah, thanks, I guess. So what we wanted to look at was some of the challenges that we've experienced doing these kind of different interventions. Some of them are shared, some of them are unique. So first of all, investment was a big issue. Obviously, on my side, there's the investment in the kit itself, actually. When we're investing in board games, that's you still need to fill out a form somewhere probably to get the money to do that, but you're not asking for the same kind of money that I potentially was. And if you want to do anything in VR at scale, remember I was doing something asymmetric with one person in VR. That wasn't too bad, but if you want a class full of people in virtual reality, suddenly we're going to get into huge costs. So that's one barrier, is the actual financial outlay. But then on top of that, we've got our staff costs in there as well. Now, I think it took me 3 hours to build that scene that I eventually used, but really that was after me playing with different VR apps for about 2 weeks before that. So I spent a lot of time of my own time kind of getting used to how VR works in order to be able to then go on and do that. So there's definitely an investment there as well. And then another different kind of investment, I guess, is the investment in those that the students have in the intervention. So this is what Angus was talking about when we were talking about instrumental students, is that some students, there's just that barrier where they will not invest in the actual intervention because they see it as, I don't know, in some way frivolous, that what we're doing is play and it's not actually part of learning. So there's all sorts of investment challenges there. On top of that, for me in particular, lots of EDI issues, so equality, diversity, inclusion stuff. Virtual reality is a wearable technology, so naturally we're going to have those health warnings of some kind. It does exclude certain people with certain conditions that mean that they can't use virtual reality, which is a real problem. Likewise, accessibility. So even if you could use virtual reality, you may not be able to actually access it in the same way that it's intended, the way that I want students to. People with glasses, they can use the virtual reality headset, but they have very mixed experiences, depending on how your glasses are built, what your prescription is, all of that kind of stuff. So there's all sorts of problems with accessibility there. And then exclusion due to time as well. I could only get 3 people in the class actually to use virtual reality. I got 100% positive feedback. The only improvement that I was asked to make, other than the graphics were a bit rubbish, which is fair because it's a free bit of software, but the only feedback I had was it would have been great if more people had time to actually use the headset. I did put on an extra hour where people could just come at the end of the day and play with it if they wanted to, and nobody turned up. But that's when you ask students to do something out of the ordinary, outside of their timetable, I guess. Angus, do you want to talk about commercial board game EDI issues?
Yeah, there are far fewer. I mean, they're pretty accessible, and I deliberately propose more accessible games. There were card-based games rather than more complicated games with lots of bits and pieces and difficulties to make that. So I think you can make that accessible. So there's less EDI issues. It's more about the kind of engagement rather than the EDI, and that's where we get to the problem for both. You're doing anything slightly out of the ordinary with students, and the question is this on the exam? Will come up. And how do you bridge that, access to encourage them to use that opportunity when it's not obvious at the outset what the benefit's going to be, because they've got to decide to invest before they see the benefit. The benefit comes at the end of the process. It's difficult to explain why playing board games is actually going to help you understand game theory, or in at least always in a classroom situation, they don't have to participate. They can sit back and watch and see what happens. And that's maybe how can you get both of those groups involved? And maybe Ollie's solution is somewhat better than mine, which was much more you had to proactively engage with it. Next slide, Ollie. And then the last thing that we both face is scalability. I think this is really where it comes into it's scalability and the classroom experience. The game-based stuff that both the VR and the board games work in small groups, because board games can only have so many players. So I could have lots of sets of Village, Pillage, and Saboteur to operate across a big class. But again, then you get the investment problems, and are you going to buy lots of the same thing to operate at scale? Or can you find ways of operating? What I do on my games night is I have actually 3 simultaneous games running with different sets, and then the students rotate round, so they get an experience of all. So they get a chance to play more than one thing, but then I need more staff in the room to help explain the games to everyone. And luckily, the board game nerds are quite happy to volunteer for games night, so I get extra staff to come along to help me. But that's because I have a good community of board game nerds to help, and we just like playing. But it's not. Is it how scalable is it to operate that beyond about? We have about 15, 20 students. That's manageable, but could we do it with 50? Would that become impracticable? And how does that fit a timetable session? Again, always working within a 50-minute timetable session. I need 2 hours, and that's difficult to timetable. It needs longer. It needs a bit of time to operate this kind of stuff because you've got a lot of things to explain, a lot of startup cost. Olly's is mostly front-loaded. Mine is in the room. You've got to explain the rules to everyone. Play doesn't take very long, and it takes the games to take about 15 minutes, but you've got a good 15, 20 minutes of explanation before we get to the play part. So again, how does that fit within a timetable session? It's quite difficult to see how this kind of activity fits within a classic classroom situation. And that's another barrier to making it more scalable and more central to the education of experience. Because mine sits on the outside, it's an optional extra, rather than becoming in the kind of main teaching event. All right, I think that's us pretty much.